Life in ancient Kofun, Japan. Not much is known about Japan's history before 4th century AD. Historians have concluded that the ancient Japanese lived in small, chief-led villages and were self-sufficient, having little contact with others outside their clan. This changed as the population grew, and by the Kofun period, the earliest murmurings of government were established. Our earliest written records come from Chinese travelers during this part of the Yamato period. The Yamato period can be split into two distinct halves: the Kofun period, 250 to 538 AD, and the Asuka period, 538 to 710 AD. The Kofun period marks the first time in Japanese history individual clans came together, and the beginnings of a cohesive kingdom were forged. And, as with any society, it needed balances and measures. One of these was establishing punishments for criminals. Let's take a look at some of the more unusual punishments used by the ancient Japanese. From ancient times all the way through to the medieval period, Japanese clans used a ritual method of execution for criminals called kozume. Although not a legally recognized criminal punishment, kozume took place privately within large clan families. It was reserved for the more heinous crimes, such as murder, rape, theft, or, even worse, associating with the lowest classes of Japanese society, who were seen as sinful. Being nice to those less fortunate is as shameful as murder, apparently. If you were sentenced to death by kozume, then you were condemned to either be buried alive or stoned to death. The most common form of kozume involved a bit of both. Priests or high-ranking members of the clan would dig a hole and tie the perpetrator to a pole in its middle. They would fill the pit with stones, which would slowly and painfully crush their lower half, while the watching crowd would throw more stones at their torso, head, and arms, until finally stoning them to death or crushing them under heavy rocks and tiles. But there are also records of kozume being used as a punishment, not just an execution method. In these cases, only the first part would take place. The person would be buried up to their torso in rocks, but no stones would be thrown, and they would be fed and given water 3 times a day by a guard, who then released them a few days later. Unfortunately, historians think this form of kozume was far less common. As the clans continued to use their own forms of justice, they also came to an agreement across the country on how to punish criminals. One of the most common forms of punishment in the first few early centuries was the death penalty, and it was doled out for murderers, rapists, and thieves, amongst other criminals. But apart from kozume, the Japanese lacked the ancient Chinese creativity in their execution methods. Instead of all the wicked and wonderful ways a lot of other ancient societies used to punish their criminals, the Japanese, in law at least, stuck to 2 of the simplest methods of execution: hanging and beheading. Later, they stopped executing people for theft altogether, in approximately 700 AD, replacing their punishment with public flogging instead. In the ancient world, there was a huge prevailing belief of gods and divine punishment. That's why, until approximately 7th century AD, one of the most popular forms of determining someone's guilt was to force them to endure a trial by ordeal. A trial by ordeal let the gods proclaim your innocence or guilt and was considered proof enough in both circumstances. The most common form of a trial by ordeal was where the accused sat in front of a pot of boiling water and was instructed to retrieve a stone from it. If their hand was burnt, they were guilty. If not, they were innocent. Of course, this would have nothing to do with the temperature of the water. Like every other large, old civilization, the Japanese used slaves to facilitate their society's growth. Slaves were known as seiko, and it was usually used as a punishment for captured prisoners of war, who were then usually put to work as farmers or house slaves. Japan, however, was ahead of the curve on slavery. Long before the rest of the world realized it maybe wasn't great to keep other human beings as property, Japan had already developed a healthy dislike of slavery and banned it in 1590, although indentured labor still existed. At this point in time, Chinese societal structure was far more advanced than Japan, where the individual clans had only just started coming together. In all fairness, Chinese dynasties had been around for some 1,000 years at this point. As such, Japan took great influence from nearby China when setting up their society and punishments. Flogging, beating, imprisonment, banishment, and death were all methods utilized by the Chinese, with each having varying degrees of severity depending on the crime. Although we don't have many records of the Yamato period, the ones we do have indicate that these were all taken on as punishments in early Japanese society, until at least the 1100s AD. When Japan moved from the Yamato period to the Nara period, this Chinese influence became more pronounced. A new capital city was erected in Nara, and Buddhism became the country's main religion. During the Nara and following Heian period, the Japanese established a criminal code named Ritsuryo and officially introduced the 5 levels of punishment, which were influenced by and almost identical to the Chinese: caning, public caning, imprisonment, exile, and death. The severity of each would depend on the crime committed. But as a result of the changing capital and influence of Buddhism, the death penalty became less and less used until it was totally phased out and no one was executed at all between 810 and 1185, the beginning of the Shogun era of Japan. Instead, officials tended to prefer the use of exile as their most severe punishment, which could be imposed on criminals for any number of offenses, including theft, rape, and murder. But throughout the Nara period, we see an overall shift to lighter, more lenient punishments as a whole, as the Ritsuryo system got examined and recodified multiple times from 668 to 770. Some historians now suggest the abolishment of the death penalty in ancient Japan is the first recorded end to capital punishment by a country in history. Want to hear more punishments from ancient history? Subscribe below quickly, before the rocks fill the screen.